41 witnesses were in Lakeshore grounds. The morning Preston Holt put his hand across Eleanor Calloway's face. 41 people who saw everything, and not one of them, not Preston Holt, not his attorneys, not his father Gerald, who had been buying silence in this city for 40 years, had any idea that the quiet man in the worn flannel jacket sitting alone in the corner had already sent one text message, 4 words. That was all it took to begin dismantling everything the Holt family had spent 3 generations building. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand Eleanor. Eleanor Calloway had a way of walking into a room that made people feel like the room had been waiting for her. Not because she was loud or grand or dressed for attention. She was none of those things. She was 69 years old, a retired school teacher who still carried a small notebook in her purse out of 44 years of habit, who still remembered the names of former students she hadn't seen in decades, who wore the same pearl earrings her late husband James had given her on their 30th anniversary, and refused to replace them even after the left clasp had been repaired twice. James had been gone for 11 years. The earrings stayed. That was Eleanor, the kind of woman who keeps the things that matter and lets everything else go quietly. She had the particular quality of certain people who have spent their whole lives genuinely paying attention to others. You felt it immediately when she looked at you, like you were the only person in the room worth listening to. Every Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock, Eleanor walked 3 blocks from her house in Travis Heights to Lakeshore grounds, a coffee shop on the south bank of Lady Bird Lake that had been there since before the neighborhood got expensive. Same corner table by the window, same order, a medium dark roast, oat milk, no sugar, same easy conversation with whoever was behind the counter. She had been coming here for 6 years. The staff knew her name, knew her order, knew to ask about her garden and her book club. She was, in the particular language of neighborhood institutions, a regular in the truest sense, not just a repeat customer, but a piece of the place itself. Danny Torres had been the morning barista at Lakeshore grounds for 2 years. 22 years old, saving for nursing school, quick-eyed and sharper than most people gave her credit for. She had a gift for reading people, something she'd developed growing up in a house where moods shifted without warning and you learned fast to see trouble coming. She'd figured out Eleanor Calloway in about 3 weeks, figured out that she was the kind of woman who tipped more than she should, who asked real questions and waited for real answers, who once spent 40 minutes helping a stranger at the next table figure out a job application on their phone without making the stranger feel like a burden. Danny thought of Eleanor the way she thought of very few people, as someone who made the world measurably better just by moving through it. The man in the flannel jacket had started coming in about 3 weeks before the Wednesday everything changed. Always solo. Always the same corner seat facing the door, back to the wall. A small thing Danny noticed but couldn't quite explain. Medium dark roast, black. He'd corrected her gently the first time she'd offered oat milk, and she'd noticed he said it without impatience, just quiet clarity. He tipped generously and said, "Thank you," each time like he meant it. He was large in a way that the worn clothes couldn't hide, broad through the shoulder, the kind of physical build that suggested a lifetime of actual use rather than a gym. He had an Australian accent, warm and unhurried. He asked about the photograph behind the counter, a 40-year-old sailboat on open water, and spent 4 minutes talking with Danny about her uncle who'd built it, asking questions that proved he knew something real about open water sailing. He read physical newspapers. He almost never looked at his phone. And there was something about the way he sat, very still, very present, that Danny couldn't quite name. Like a person who had trained themselves to notice everything without appearing to notice anything. On his second week, a man at the counter had knocked over a full tray of ceramic cups. A sharp, sudden crash that made every person in the cafe flinch and look toward the sound. Every person except the man in the flannel jacket. He didn't flinch. He didn't look toward the crash. Instead, in the half-second after the sound, his eyes moved quietly to the front door, then the side exit, then back to his newspaper, as if the crash was just information and the doors were what mattered. Danny had watched that happen and stood very still behind the espresso machine, trying to figure out what she had just seen. She mentioned him to Eleanor once. "That guy in the corner, does he seem different to you?" Eleanor had glanced over. "Different how? I don't know. Like, careful, like he's always doing two things at once." Eleanor smiled. "Some people carry a lot without showing it. That doesn't make them dangerous. It usually makes them interesting." Danny had thought about that for days. She was still thinking about it when Preston Holt walked through the door on that Wednesday morning and began the worst mistake of his life. Preston Holt arrived at Lakeshore Grounds at 8:22 not because he liked the coffee. He considered anything below a private dining room in a five-star hotel beneath his standards, but because the construction on Congress Avenue had made his usual route to the office impossible, and his driver had suggested this waterfront street as an alternate. He had 40 minutes before a 9 o'clock call with lawyers from Dallas, and he needed somewhere with outlets and enough quiet to review the contracts spread across his briefcase. He was 52 years old, CEO of Holt Meridian Group, the family's hospitality and commercial real estate empire that had been built by his father Gerald across 4 decades and handed to Preston a decade ago with the understanding that he would expand it and not embarrass it. He had expanded it. The embarrassment part had always been a closer call. The Holt Meridian name meant something in Texas. 31 properties across 6 states, boutique hotels, luxury resort developments, high-end commercial towers, a private members club in Dallas that charged $48,000 a year and had a 3-year waiting list. Preston had grown up in penthouse suites and first-class cabins, in rooms where every surface was either marble or glass, and the staff knew better than to make eye contact unless addressed. He had the deep, structural confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life been made to genuinely account for himself. And that confidence had curdled, over 52 years, into something that was no longer confidence at all. It was contempt, reflexive, constant, aimed at anyone he had decided didn't matter. He settled at a table 2 away from Eleanor's without acknowledging her presence, spread his documents, ordered without looking at Danny, set his phone face up in the center of the table like a declaration. For about 7 minutes, nothing happened. Eleanor finished a chapter, picked up her cup, and shifted in her chair to reach the cardigan draped over the back. It was a small movement, the kind a person makes 100 times a day without thinking. Her elbow caught the edge of her canvas tote, which slid off the chair and swung outward, and the corner of it brushed the edge of Preston's briefcase, which sat open on the chair between their tables. The briefcase tilted. A stack of unbound contract pages slid forward, fanning across the table and into the remainder of Preston's coffee. Dark liquid spread across 6 pages of a hotel acquisition agreement. Not catastrophic, a nuisance, the kind of thing that happens in shared spaces between strangers. Eleanor was already reaching forward. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Here, let me." "Don't." Preston's hand came down flat on the table. The sound made Danny look up from the espresso machine. Eleanor paused, her hand still extended with a stack of napkins. "I just want to help clean. You've done enough." He looked at her then, the particular way that some men look at certain women in certain spaces, a look that contains an entire argument about who belongs and who doesn't, delivered without a single word. "Do you have any idea what these are? I imagine they're important documents, and I'm very sorry they got wet. I'd like to help. Help He said the word like it tasted wrong. What exactly is it you think you can help with? These are acquisition contracts for a $240 million resort development. Do you understand what that means? He leaned back, his voice dropping into the register of a man enjoying himself. Of course you don't. What are you even doing here? The cafe had gone quiet. Danny's hand had stopped moving on the portafilter. The man reading his newspaper 2 tables away had gone very still. I come here every Wednesday morning, Eleanor said. Her voice was completely steady. I've been a regular for 6 years. I didn't ask your schedule. I asked what you're doing in an establishment like this. He gestured at her with 2 fingers, a dismissive wave that encompassed her entirety. People like you really need to learn which spaces are appropriate. 3 things happened in the next 30 seconds. Danny reached under the counter for her phone and pressed record. The man in the worn flannel jacket folded his newspaper with a single, unhurried motion and set it down. And Eleanor Calloway, 69 years old, retired school teacher, someone who had spent 44 years teaching children that every human being possessed inherent dignity. Eleanor straightened in her chair and looked at Preston Holt with the particular calm of a woman who has navigated this specific cruelty many times before and is no longer surprised by it, only saddened. Sir, she said, I believe I have every right to be in this cafe, and I believe you know that. I've apologized sincerely for an accident, and I've offered to help with any damage. There's nothing more I can reasonably do. Preston Holt stared at her. The idea that this woman, this nobody, this irrelevance, would sit there and correct him, would look at him with that unrattled, patient expression, as though he were a student who'd given a wrong answer. You don't get to lecture me. He stood up, towering now, deliberate about the height. You don't get to sit there and act like you have any standing to. Sir, Danny's voice from behind the counter, I need to ask you to lower your voice. Preston turned on her with the full force of a man who had never once been corrected by someone earning an hourly wage. You need to mind your business and do your job. And you, he turned back to Eleanor, you need to sit down and figure out how you plan to compensate me for what you've cost me this morning. I've already offered to pay for any cleaning costs or reprinting. I'm not talking about cleaning costs. He stepped closer. I'm talking about my time, my morning, the call I'm going to have to delay because of you. Do you have any idea what my hourly rate is worth? People like you walk around this city like you belong here, like you have some claim on spaces that were built by. He stopped, recalculated, and then said very quietly the words that ended his world. He said them clearly enough that Danny's phone, sitting on the counter with its screen pointed toward the tables, caught every syllable. Eleanor looked at him, not with anger, with something that was harder to face than anger, a complete, unafraid recognition of exactly what he was. Young man, she said, you are going to regret this morning for the rest of your life. That was when his hand moved. The sound of it was flat and sharp, the way those sounds always are, too loud for the space, too real to process immediately. Eleanor's head turned, her pearl earring, James's earring, 30 years married, twice repaired, flew from her ear and hit the floor and rolled. For one full second, nobody in Lakeshore grounds moved, not one person. The espresso machine stopped hissing. A cup sat halfway to someone's lips and stayed there. The light off Ladybird Lake kept coming through the windows the same as it always did, indifferent and gold, falling across a room that had gone completely, unnaturally still. Then Danny said, clearly and without panic, I'm calling the police. A man in a business suit near the window was already on his phone. 2 women near the door had their cameras up, 6, 8, 10 recording devices, capturing Preston Holt in the long still moment before he understood what he'd done. Eleanor touched her cheek. She did not cry. She sat up very straight and she looked at Preston Holt with the quietest expression in the room. I taught school for 44 years, she said. I have had students who were frightened, students who were angry, students who lashed out because they didn't know any other way. Every one of them, given time and the right guidance, learned better. She paused. I genuinely hope you do too. Preston was already reaching for his phone, already composing the damage control narrative in his head. His father would handle this. His father had handled far worse. The Holt name meant something in this city. It had meant something for 40 years, which meant the machinery was deep and the connections were old, and one incident in a coffee shop near the lake was not going to. Across the room, the man in the worn flannel jacket was already moving. He crossed the cafe in 4 quiet strides and crouched beside Eleanor's table. He picked up the earring from the floor, holding it with the careful hands of someone who understood what it represented. Not the object, but the person it belonged to. He stood and held it out to her without saying anything first, just waiting for her to be ready. She looked up at him. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read quickly. The eyes were dark and taking in a great deal more than they offered back. He was looking at her with an expression that was not pity, not outrage. Something closer to recognition, the particular recognition of someone who has also spent a long time watching dignity be treated as optional. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The Australian accent was soft, unhurried. "I'm all right," Eleanor said. She closed her fingers around the earring. James's earring, the one she had never once considered not wearing, and held it in her palm for a moment before putting it back. "Thank you." He made sure she was steady. Then he stood straight, and for one moment he looked across the small cafe at Preston Holt. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward him. He simply looked. The way the horizon looks at a small boat that has wandered too far from shore. Preston looked away first. The man in the flannel jacket walked to the door, stepped outside, and stood at the water's edge for 90 seconds, looking at Lady Bird Lake. His hands were in his pockets. He didn't pace. He didn't reach for his phone. He stood the way a person stands when they are making a decision that doesn't need to be rushed, because it has already been made. Danny watched him through the window. She had been trying to name something about him for 3 weeks. Standing there at the water in his worn jacket and his scuffed boots, she finally did. He looked like a man who was accustomed to having patience, not the patience of someone waiting for something, the patience of someone who already knows how this ends. He came back inside, sat down, sent one text message, 4 words, and placed his phone face down on the table. Then he waited for the police to arrive. What those 4 words set in motion is the part of this story that Preston Holt would spend the rest of the year trying and failing to fully understand. Eleanor's son called at 9:14, while she was still giving her statement to the 2 APD officers who had arrived 7 minutes after Danny's call. She stepped away to answer. "Mum." The voice was careful, warm in the particular way it was only ever warm with her. "Christopher, how did you?" "Danny texted me. She has my number from when I fixed the espresso machine last month." A brief pause. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor touched her cheek. The bruising was already coming up. She could feel the heat of it beneath her fingers. "A bruise. Nothing serious. I'm coming." "Christopher, you don't need to. I'm already in the car." The sound of Austin traffic behind his voice. "Mum, listen to me. Don't sign anything. Don't talk to any of his representatives if they approach you. And don't worry about this." "I'm not worried. I'm just." She watched through the window as Preston Holt spoke in low, urgent tones to someone on his phone, already constructing the version of events he would deploy. "I'm just sad that a man his age still carries that much hatred around with him." Silence on the line. Then simply, "I know. You're not going to do anything that causes problems for you." "I'm not going to do anything at all," Chris said. "I'm just going to make a few calls." Something in the word few, the way it landed quiet and precise, made Eleanor pause. not the word itself, the tone beneath it. "Christopher, I'll see you tonight. I'll bring the soup from Garrow's." The call ended. But here is what you need to understand about the man Eleanor called Christopher, because it explains everything that came next. He was not always the person he became. That's not how it works for anyone, and it certainly wasn't how it worked for him. In the spring of 2003, Chris Hemsworth was 19 years old and living in a single room above a boxing gym in Melbourne. He had been training Muay Thai 6 days a week for 2 years, and the gym owner, a retired middleweight named Dale Crawford, who believed that discipline was the purest form of respect, had taken him on as an informal assistant in exchange for reduced rent and coaching. He earned the rest working construction laboring, arriving on site before dawn, and leaving after the gym closed at night. His parents were in Northern Territory, his brothers were younger, and needed whatever was left. He had nothing that looked like a plan. He had the gym, the work, and a quality Dale had identified in him early: an unusual stillness in high-pressure moments, the ability to slow down when everything around him was speeding up. That spring, Dale's gym faced closure. A commercial developer had purchased the building and intended to convert the entire block into luxury apartments. The eviction notice gave 30 days. Dale had run the gym for 18 years. 40 kids from the surrounding neighborhood trained there, most of them paying nothing or close to it. The gym was the only reason some of them had somewhere to be after school. Chris sat in the empty gym the night the notice arrived and looked at the worn canvas bags hanging from the ceiling, at Dale's framed photographs on the wall, at the scuff marks on the floor from 10,000 training sessions. He thought about the kind of power that could walk into a place like this and erase it with a piece of paper. He thought about what it would take to make sure that kind of power could never do that to something he cared about again. He didn't save the gym. He didn't have the resources then. Dale found another location eventually, smaller and farther from the neighborhood, and the transition cost them half their members. Chris left Melbourne the following year to pursue acting, carrying with him the memory of that night and a very clear understanding that the only reliable protection against that kind of erasure was to build something of your own. He still carried a small callus on the base of his right palm. Dale's training hand wraps, worn unevenly for 2 years, had left a permanent ridge in the skin. On the mornings when the investment work felt abstract or distant from anything that mattered, he pressed that hand flat against whatever surface was in front of him and held it there for one breath. It was the closest thing he had to a compass. He had been pressing it against the wooden table at Lakeshore grounds that morning, very briefly, while he read the newspaper, before Preston Holt walked through the door. What happened over the next 72 hours did not look like revenge. It didn't announce itself. A few calls made from a rented house in Travis Heights. A few emails exchanged between attorneys across 3 time zones. A property management review initiated by a holding company that most people in Austin had never heard of. What it was underneath was architecture. The slow and thorough removal of every structural support that had kept Preston Holt from facing consequences for 52 years. Because the Holt name was old and the money was deep, and the people he had hurt along the way had been, each time, carefully selected for their perceived inability to fight back. He had miscalculated, profoundly, but he wouldn't understand the scale of it for another 4 days. Chris Hemsworth had come to Austin in 2021, looking for a city that still had the feel of itself. He had bought a house in Travis Heights through a holding company, 3 minutes from his mother, which was the actual reason for the city. He enrolled his investment activity under Thematic Capital, his Australian-registered private equity firm, and over 3 years of patient work had acquired significant commercial real estate along Austin's Central Corridor, a mixed-use development on South Congress. 2 warehouse conversions on the east side, a partial stake in a boutique hotel on 2nd Street, and Congress Tower, a 22-story glass and steel commercial building on Congress Avenue, home to 43 tenants, including, on the 14th and 15th floors, the Austin headquarters of Holt Meridian Group. Chris had paid no particular attention to Holt Meridian as a tenant. They paid on time. They occupied their floors without incident. They were, from a property management perspective, unremarkable. He had no reason to think about them at all until Wednesday morning. His first call was to his property attorney in Austin, a woman named Victoria Shaw, who had worked with Thematic Capital since the Congress Tower acquisition. He explained what he needed in 2 sentences. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "The lease renewal is coming up in 60 days, she said. "I know. Do you want me to pull the conduct clause in Section 11? "Pull it. Review the video from this morning. It's already circulating. Tell me what you think." Victoria called back in 2 hours. Section 11 is clear. Material damage to the building's professional reputation or community standing. The video has 400,000 views, and it's climbing. The audio is... She paused. "The audio is very bad for him, Chris. Draft a non-renewal notice. 90 days, standard language, Section 11 reference. Effective immediately upon service. Done by end of day." His second call was to a civil rights attorney in Houston named Marcus Webb. Not a friend, an acquaintance through a mutual contact. Someone whose work Chris had followed and respected for years. He explained the situation. He offered to fund representation for Eleanor through trial, if it came to that, and to cover all legal costs for any former employees whose NDAs were worth examining. Marcus said he'd be on a plane by Thursday morning. The third call was the one that cost him something. Not money. Something harder than that. He called his mother. "Mum, I need to tell you something." "All right. The building on Congress where that man's company has its offices. I own it." Silence. "I've owned it since 2021. I never connected it to him. I didn't know who he was until this morning." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Outside the window of Chris's rented house, Lady Bird Lake caught the afternoon light and held it. Somewhere on the water, a boat moved slowly past the bank, unhurried, the way things move when they have no idea what just happened 3 blocks away. "And now?" she asked. "Now his lease is coming up in 60 days, and I've asked my attorney to review whether his conduct this morning is grounds for non-renewal under the terms of the agreement." Another silence. Then, "Christopher, is this justice or is this punishment?" He thought about that honestly. He pressed his right palm flat against the desk and held it there. "Both," he said. "But I think in this case they're the same thing. Don't let it make you something you're not." "I won't. And make sure the people he's actually hurt. Not just me, make sure they have what they need." "Already done." She made a small sound that was not quite a word. Something between acknowledgement and love. "Bring extra soup tonight." Preston Holt's Wednesday had not improved. APD had cited him for assault. His personal attorney, not one of his own firm's people, someone private, had advised him to say as little as possible and had begun the familiar process of management. A process that had, over the years, quietly absorbed 3 workplace harassment complaints, 2 wrongful termination lawsuits, and 1 incident at a private club in Dallas that no one outside a very small circle was supposed to know about. The video was a problem. 400,000 views by noon. 800,000 by 3 in the afternoon. His PR firm issued a statement calling the incident a misunderstanding and expressing regret for any offense taken, the careful language of an apology that accepts no responsibility. His father Gerald called from the family estate outside San Antonio and spoke for 4 minutes in the measured, cold tone he used when he was genuinely concerned. "Handle this quietly," Gerald said. "It's already being handled. I'm not asking if it's being handled. I'm telling you to handle it quietly, No trials. No discovery. Whatever it costs. I know what to do, Dad. You knew what to do this morning, too. The call ended. Gerald Holt sat in the study of his San Antonio estate for a long time after that. The room was full of framed photographs and deal tombstones from 4 decades of building. The first Holt Meridian property in 1987, the 10th, the 20th. A heavy Swiss timepiece on the desk that his own father had given him when he turned 40. He picked it up, turned it over once in his hands, and set it back down without looking at it. In 37 years of managing crises, he had learned to tell the difference between a problem and a reckoning. This one felt like the second kind. By Thursday morning, the video had 1.2 million views. The Austin Chronicle ran a piece titled, "Holt Meridian's CEO Caught on Video in Racially Charged Assault at Ladybird Lake Café." The story named him, quoted witnesses, and embedded the full recording. By afternoon, the Texas Tribune had picked it up. By evening, it had reached national outlets. And then Marcus Webb arrived from Houston, and things began to move in a different direction entirely. What Marcus found, working through the employment records and settlement files that 3 former Holt Meridian employees were now willing to share, was not one bad morning. It was a pattern, documented, dated, and connected by a single name. The first was a woman named Renee Caldwell, 38 years old, formerly Director of Operations at Holt Meridian's San Antonio property. She had been terminated on March 14, 2021, 14 days after filing an internal HR complaint alleging racial harassment from Preston during a performance review. Her termination letter, signed by Holt Meridian's Chief People Officer, cited restructuring. Her NDA had paid out $62,000. On the day Marcus Webb called her, she said, "I've been waiting for someone to call for 3 years. I just didn't think anyone ever would." The second was a man named Derek Okafor, 44 years old, a senior events manager at Holt Meridian's Austin headquarters, who had been publicly dressed down by Preston in front of the entire events team on January 9, 2023, a Monday morning, 9:17 a.m., for a catering error that had occurred under a different supervisor. Preston had used language in that meeting that 3 other employees had recorded on their phones. All 3 had signed amended NDAs within the following week. Derek had kept his copy of the original complaint. He had kept everything. The third was a woman named Sandra Pierce, 51 years old, a 20-year veteran of Holt Meridian's administrative staff who had watched what happened to Renee and to Derek and had said nothing. She had told herself each time that she had a mortgage and 2 children in college and couldn't afford to become the next example. But when Marcus Webb explained that Eleanor Calloway's son was covering all legal costs, that the NDAs were being reviewed for enforceability, that the 3 of them would not be standing alone. Sandra Pierce sat in her kitchen in East Austin for a long moment, looked at the table where she'd eaten dinner alone every night since her youngest left for college, and said, "Tell me what you need from me." These 3 voices, taken together, told a story that was not about one bad morning in a coffee shop. They told the story of a man who had operated this way for decades, in full confidence that the people he harmed would never be able to reach him. He had been right about that, until now. The non-renewal notice from Congress Tower reached Holt Meridian's offices on Thursday afternoon. Standard letterhead, professional language, 90 days, effective upon service, citing Section 11 of the existing lease agreement. Preston read it twice and called his real estate attorney. "Who owns Congress Tower?" His attorney came back in 20 minutes. "Held through a Texas LLC, Lakeshore Properties Austin, traces to a Delaware holding entity, then to a registered Australian company, Thematic Capital Ty Limited." Preston went very still. "Australian. Chris Hemsworth's private investment firm. He keeps a very low profile here, but has been acquiring commercial properties in Austin since 2021. The Congress Tower acquisition closed in. That man in the cafe. Preston's voice had changed. Something had drained out of it. Not quite fear, but the particular emptiness that comes when structural confidence meets the edge of something it cannot move. The man in the flannel jacket. His attorney said nothing. Preston set the phone down and stood at his office window, 14th floor, Congress Tower, the Austin skyline spreading west toward the hills, the dome of the Capitol visible to the north. His office, his view, his name on the door. 90 days. He didn't call his father right away, because before he could, his assistant knocked and said the words he had been dreading since Wednesday morning. The board wants an emergency session. Conference room. 30 minutes. There were 9 people in the Holt Meridian boardroom when Preston walked in. 9 people he had sat across from for a decade. Men and women who had co-signed his decisions, attended his father's dinners, smiled at his expansion presentations. They were all already seated. Not one of them looked up when he entered. Richard Calloway, no relation, the firm's general counsel, stood at the head of the table with a single sheet of paper. He had the measured expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment twice before breakfast. "We've reviewed the non-renewal notice from Congress Tower," Richard said, "and we've identified the ownership structure." He set the paper on the table, face up, so the room could see the name. "The building is owned through Thematic Capital Pty Limited, an Australian private equity firm." He paused long enough to make the pause its own sentence. "Founded and controlled by Chris Hemsworth." Nobody spoke. The air conditioning hummed. 8 pairs of eyes moved from the paper to Preston's face. Preston stood at the doorway of his own boardroom and understood fully and completely that there was nowhere in this room to go. Not one person at that table was going to hand him a way out. They had the video. They had the building notice. They had the name, and they were sitting very still, the way people sit when they are waiting for you to something that will tell them who you actually are. Preston pulled out the chair at his usual end of the table. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the surface in front of him, the same way he would sit, weeks later, across from Eleanor Calloway in a coffee shop by the lake. And he said nothing at all for a long time. Richard Calloway did not fill the silence for him. He called his father. Gerald listened without interrupting. When Preston finished, the silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. "You hit a woman," Gerald said finally, "in public, on camera, and her son owns the building you've operated out of for 11 years. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know. That's the problem, Preston. You have never once, in 52 years, considered that the person in front of you might matter. You have never had to." A long pause. "I'm going to call Richard in legal. We'll request a meeting with Thematic Capital. Offer a settlement, rent concession, multi-year commitment, whatever they want. This isn't about the building, Dad. Everything is about something," Gerald said. "Find out what this is about, then fix it." What it was about was Eleanor. Victoria Shaw's office arranged a meeting for Friday morning. Chris didn't attend. He sent Victoria with a single written instruction. "Listen, don't offer anything. Don't negotiate. Just listen to what they say." Gerald Holt's attorneys came in with a package: lease concession offers, a public statement from Preston, a private settlement figure for Eleanor. Generous numbers. The practiced language of a family that had been purchasing silence for 4 decades and had become very fluent in it. Victoria thanked them and said she would relay the information. Then she said one other thing. She said that her client's primary concern was not the lease. It was that 3 former Holt Meridian employees who had filed internal complaints. Complaints resolved under NDAs had now connected with Civil Rights Counsel, and those NDAs were under active legal review. She said that if the Holt family wished to discuss a path forward that addressed the full scope of the situation, Her client was willing to have that conversation. Gerald's attorneys went back to San Antonio. The consequences arrived in sequence over the following weeks, each one specific and documented and impossible to quietly absorb. Holt Meridian Group stock closed down 18% on the Friday after the Austin Chronicle story ran. A loss of approximately $94 million in market capitalization in a single trading session, as 3 institutional investors filed disclosure notices about their positions before the close of business. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece the following Monday titled, "Holt Meridian's Governance Problem: What the Austin Video Revealed About Leadership Culture." It was not a short piece. On Tuesday of that same week, a class action filing was prepared by the Houston firm of Webb, Castillo and Associates on behalf of Renee Caldwell, Derek Okafor, Sandra Pierce, and 4 additional former employees who had come forward after the Tribune coverage. The filing cited a pattern of racially motivated harassment, wrongful termination, and the systematic use of NDAs to suppress legitimate complaints. Spanning 9 years and 4 Holt Meridian properties across Texas. By the end of the month, the Texas Workforce Commission had opened a formal inquiry into Holt Meridian Group's HR practices company-wide. The notification letter was 3 paragraphs. The language was bureaucratic. What it meant, translated plainly, was that the state had decided to look carefully at everything. On January 6th, Gerald Holt resigned from the board of Holt Meridian Group, the announcement citing health reasons. The statement was 2 sentences. On February 2nd, Preston Holt was placed on indefinite leave of absence by the remaining board members, effective at 4:30 p.m. under Section 7(4) of the Executive Conduct Policy, the clause governing conduct materially inconsistent with the company's stated values and legal obligations. The vote was unanimous. 3 board members had been present for the Renee Caldwell settlement in 2021 and had said nothing at the time. Now they signed their names to the termination paperwork and went home. His attorney had not written that part either. Holt Meridian's Austin offices relocated to a building on West 6th Street in March. Congress Tower stood, as it always had, at the corner of Congress Avenue, home now to 42 tenants who went about their business without knowing or caring who signed the ownership papers. But before all of that, before the filings and the stock price and the board vote, there was a meeting at Lakeshore grounds. It was Eleanor's idea. Her condition, actually. She had told Marcus Webb that she would not proceed with any legal settlement until she had sat across from Preston Holt in the place where it happened and heard him speak for himself. Not through attorneys, not through a prepared statement, himself. Preston arrived on a Thursday morning wearing a jacket and no tie, which, for a man who considered his wardrobe a form of armor, was the equivalent of arriving without one. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days, because he hadn't. He sat across from Eleanor Calloway and put his hands flat on the table and looked at her directly. Chris sat 2 tables away. He did not look at Preston once. "I don't have a speech," Preston said. "My lawyers wrote one. I threw it away." Eleanor waited. "What I did was wrong. Not just legally wrong. Wrong in the way that I can't fix with money or a statement, and I know that, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise." He stopped. Started again. "I've been thinking about what you said, that you hope I learn better. And I've been thinking about the fact that you said it to me after what I'd just done to you, and you said it like you meant it." He looked at his hands on the table. "I don't know how a person gets to that place." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. 44 years of teaching," she said. "You stop assuming people can't change, even the difficult ones." Preston said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I'll accept your apology," Eleanor said. "Not because what you did was small, it wasn't. And not because saying sorry undoes it. It doesn't." She looked at him directly. "I'll accept it because I believe in the possibility of people. I have to. I've built my entire life on it." Preston nodded once. His eyes were wet. He didn't seem to know what to do about that, so he simply let it be. "The people who worked for you," Eleanor said, "that the ones who filed complaints, make sure they're taken care of. Not settled, taken care of. There's a difference. Yes, ma'am. And get some help. Whatever it is that made you do what you did, that comes from somewhere, find out where and deal with it. Not for my sake, for yours." Preston stood. He looked once and briefly at the man in the corner with the Australian accent and the worn flannel jacket and the copy of the morning paper. Chris was reading the sports section. He didn't look up. Preston walked out of Lakeshore grounds into the September morning. 6 months later, Eleanor Calloway walked into Lakeshore grounds at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday, exactly as she always had. Danny had her order pulling before she reached the counter. "Morning, Eleanor." "Morning, sweetheart. How's the nursing school application?" Danny grinned. "I got in." Eleanor's face did the thing it did, the real, complete, unperformative thing, and she reached across the counter and held Danny's hand for a moment. Just for a moment. "I knew you would." She took her coffee to her corner table. The light off Lady Bird Lake was doing what it did at this hour, coming in low and gold off the water, filling the whole front of the cafe with the kind of light that makes ordinary things look considered. The man in the worn flannel jacket was already in his corner, newspaper, black coffee, boots scuffed at the toe. He looked up when she came in, gave her a small nod. She gave him one back. She sat down and opened her book. Before she began reading, she reached up and touched the pearl earring on her left ear. Just once, briefly, the way she always did in the morning. A habit from 11 years ago that she had never tried to explain to anyone and never intended to. James would have found the whole thing remarkable. Not the billionaire in the flannel jacket, not the law firms or the stock price or the board vote. He would have found it remarkable that she had looked that man in the eye and said what she said. James had always believed in her capacity for that. She was only now, in her 69th year, beginning to understand exactly what he'd seen. A stranger watching them from outside the window would never have guessed. That is the thing about the people who actually matter. They don't announce it. They just show up. Same table. Same time. Same quiet understanding that the most important things are usually the smallest ones. Eleanor opened her book. The boats moved on the water. Austin went about its morning. And somewhere across the city, in a community center on the east side, a man named Preston Holt was on his 3rd week of Saturday service. Stacking chairs, sweeping floors, learning the names of the elderly residents he served lunch to every week. His supervisor, a 73-year-old retired principal named Clara May Washington, took no nonsense and gave no shortcuts. "You know what your problem was?" She'd told him on his first day, looking up at him with the particular authority of a woman who had managed difficult people for 50 years. "I imagine you're going to tell me," Preston said. "You thought money was the same as worth. It isn't. Worth is what you do when nobody's watching. When there's nothing in it for you. When the person in front of you has nothing to give you back." She handed him a broom. "Start with the east hallway and do it right." He did it right. Every Saturday, he did it right. It wasn't enough to undo what he'd done. It never would be. But Eleanor Calloway had taught school for 44 years on the belief that people were capable of more than their worst moments. That given the right conditions, the right accountability, the right honest reckoning with what they'd done, most people could find their way towards something better. She hadn't stopped believing that, not even for him. That is the thing about dignity. It isn't something you can take from a person, no matter how hard you try. It belongs to them completely, earned through a lifetime of small choices, small kindnesses, small moments of choosing to believe in people, even when they have given you every reason not to. It cannot be slapped away. It cannot be bought or bargained or legally settled out of existence. Preston Holt spent one morning trying to diminish Eleanor Calloway. What he actually did was spend the rest of his year learning what she had known her entire life: that the most powerful person in any room is almost never the loudest one. It is the one who stays standing after you have done your worst, who looks at you with clear eyes and says, "I genuinely hope you learn better," and means it. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever watched someone choose dignity over retaliation and understood that it was the harder and braver thing, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like if you believe the most revolutionary act is refusing to let hatred make you hateful. And subscribe, because every week we bring you stories about the kind of strength that does not announce itself, the kind that simply endures and waits, and in the end, always outlasts everything thrown against it. This is a fictional dramatized story created for educational and inspirational purposes. All supporting characters, businesses, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons other than Chris Hemsworth is coincidental. Narration is AI-assisted.